Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We're really welcome today. Lots of new people. Lovely to see Bryony's finally got Bryony to join us, one of our editors. Bryony's been our editor right from the beginning of our podcast. We finally got her to come and join us on screen. So welcome, Bryony. And we've also got two BPS award winners with us today. We have Emily, who recently won the Early Career Award, and we have Brendan, who's been given an award for his contributions to forensic psychology. So we're very honoured today to have so many guests. Um, so Brendan is going to talk to us today about his very many roles. He's got roles as intermediary within this criminal justice system. He's talked internationally, including South Korea, Japan, Ukraine, Taiwan, in his role of a justice intermediary about human rights, sexual exploitation, abuse, harassment investigations. So he's got a really varied career. We met on our master's degree, did our master's together at Leicester. So it's lovely to be
We
back
did.
with you again. So there is a lot to talk about, so I won't spend a lot of time on the introduction, Brendan. And I would wonder maybe you could start off by telling us a bit about your awards and why you were given the BPS award recently.
Yes, okay. I think one of the things that I really want to just put out there is the dual role that I've had is what's seen as core forensic psychology, perhaps of the Parole Board, and doing the work of the Parole Board that I do. So I'm a panel member, a psychologist panel member for the Parole Board. And over the last couple of years, so I've been a Parole Board member since 2016. Of the last couple of years, I was co-opted onto a committee with the Vice Chair, who's on Judge Peter Rook, and a barrister called Cassie, and someone external, another barrister, and brought in a speech and language therapist to come in and join this committee to look at the issue of questioning vulnerable prisoners at parole board hearings. So I was on that committee. I still am on it, I think, co-opted in. And we developed a training package for all parole board members. So every parole board member attends this training about the questioning of vulnerable prisoners. So I've been doing that for the last few years. That training is ongoing, and all new members will receive that training. So that's ongoing. And the intermediary work which I've done, I did a practitioner doctorate, which I finished 11 years ago, which is amazing where that time has gone. But I was working and still am working as an intermediary in the criminal justice system, and doing some publishing. So I'm a pracademic, so I've been doing some research as well as being a practitioner, publishing work along the way. And yeah, I'd like to talk more about that, so, as we go along. And doing some work now. So I've been invited just before Christmas. I was over in Poland, and we were delivering training to Ukrainian police officers and Ukrainian prosecutors. Brilliant opportunity with the Norwegian Centre for Human Rights, who invited me. My role there was talking about investigative interviewing, and trauma, and how trauma comes into the interview room and how it can be managed in the interview room context. So lots of different things going on there, and I think that on the back of all of that, I was honoured to receive the Practitioner Award at the end of last year.
I always want to try and think of something like really like clever or professional to say, but all that I have to say is that you've done some really cool things, haven't you? Like really, really cool. And like you said, we want to hear about them throughout this episode. But could we like to strip it right back and go right back to the beginning? And could you tell us all how you became who you are? How did you become a forensic psychologist?
It's a very convoluted story, my journey into forensic psychology. So I was a police officer in London initially. From 1988, I joined the Metropolitan Police. I was a uniformed police officer. And I think that's where my interest in psychology actually came from, as well as world religions. So I was working in East London, and I was obviously interviewing victims of crime, witnesses of crime. I was arresting people. I was interviewing police suspects. And I was involved in the world of I guess the fire brigade policing, of going to assaults and street robberies and car crime, and what in those days would have been called domestic violence incidents, now intimate partner violence. So I was exposed, in my younger days to the world of crime and courts. I went to court, I gave evidence. So those were my initial days. I took a short career break, or 3-year career break, went to university, studied social sciences and world religions for 3 years, rejoined the police, went back into the police in London after that. And unfortunately, after another couple of years on the streets, I picked up a serious injury, which resulted in the end of my career eventually. So that happened. But before I left policing, I did become a police trainer. And I had some wonderful opportunities as a police trainer. I was training new recruits. I was training investigative interviewing. So I was training police officers how to interview victims, witnesses, and suspects. And in those days, I didn't know about the world of forensic psychology until I actually did complete the masters, as Jerry's saying, in forensic psychology in 1998, I think it was, we started that. So I was still serving in the police at that time, and I was training police officers about investigative interviewing. But I left the police. The story is I left the police in 2001. I did some voluntary work with a youth offending team, and I worked with reparation orders, so young people who had been convicted and came to the youth offending team, and I was like the independent community member who sat down and spoke to them about their offending behaviour and how they were going to desist from it going forwards. So I did that for a while, really enjoyed that. Then I had another very short career, and I trained to be a connections personal advisor. So I said it's convoluted. And I trained to be, so in the olden days, they would have been historically careers advisors, going into schools and being careers advisors. At the time I did it, which was 20 years, just over 20 years ago, I went a dual role. So it's to give careers advice, but the area that I really sort of was drawn together was going into schools and speaking to teenagers between the ages of 13 and 18 who had social, emotional, behavioural difficulties. And that's where I think my skill set was of talking to the young people who had those difficulties. And we were trained in solution focused therapy. And, you know, in those days, I was working with young people who were going through adolescence, who were having difficulties managing their emotions. There was issues of anger that people were coming to speak to me about. And I think there was all sorts of issues about attention deficit and all the issues that you might expect might be there in some school, in some pupils. And I really, really enjoyed working with those young people, trying to help them, trying to assist them, trying to guide them. But I had to refer on. I wasn't qualified. So self-harming issues, there was all sorts of issues. And I referred on to the appropriate agencies at that time. And I thought, you know, I actually want to be working with the real issues here, not always, you know, referring on to other people. I missed out a bit. I did miss out a little bit. I spent 1 year with a major investigation team at Essex Police as well, prior to becoming a connections person advisor. So I worked with a fantastic team of detectives in Essex in 2003 for a year, and I was an inquiries officer on a major investigation team. So I think that was the end of my real experience of the policing. I wasn't a warranted officer at that time. I was actually a civilian at that time. But I guess there's always been a connection for me with the investigative side of stuff, and that's carried on throughout my career in forensic psychology. So I made the decision to look at training to be a forensic psychologist. I was fortunate. I found a placement as an assistant psychologist, very brief, as an assistant psychologist in a medium secure unit. I got a job, very lucky. I got a job as a trainee forensic psychologist, and I spent 3 years in a medium secure hospital training to be a forensic psychologist. So that was my training ground. It wasn't in a prison. I was in the healthcare sector, and in that role, I worked on the adapted sex offender treatment program. I worked on violence, with violence sort of reduction program, with fire setting. And what I really enjoyed about those 3 years was I got to work with clinical psychologists, counselling psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical counselling psychologists, social workers, nursing staff, healthcare assistants, you know, the full range, occupational therapists, And I think that was a really good, broad introduction to me to the world of forensic psychology, going in with that basis. So it has been convoluted. It's been quite a quite a journey into forensic psychology for me. And I guess I've been very lucky to be able to combine all my interests as my career has gone forward.
It's really interesting. I've often said I've been very lucky, and people say, well, it's not luck, it's hard work that's got you where you are. It's not just been by luck you've got there, but it
Yeah,
sounds like
it's
all your strands have pulled together, and I can totally see why your training with interviewing within those contexts of the police would be so useful in a forensic psychology setting as
yeah,
well.
and I always thought that about. I mean, I think it was in Forensic Update. There was a paper that I got published many years ago in Forensic Update, and I think I was looking at investigative interviewing that's done in the police context, and how that might be of assistance using the similar sort of psychological evidence base when investigating, when working with offenders, or prisoners, residents, whatever language we use in the context of people who've been detained. And I read that paper quite a long time ago, Forensic Update. I haven't mentioned the intermediary side of things really, and where that came from. And that came from, it emerged about the same time that I was in training as a forensic psychologist. And it came from my history from working with victims of crime in the community as a police officer, from training police officers, but also in working in the hospital I worked with the patients had been detained under the Mental Health Act, and every one of them had intellectual disabilities. And so they were on adapted programs for their learning, and I was really interested in the how the programs were adapted or had to be adapted, and how language had to be changed in order to be effective. And it was all of that came together, and then this role came out in the criminal justice system about intermediaries, and I thought this is really sort of, it's going to bring everything together for me, and that's how I got into that, working with the police. Advising the police, advising the courts about adapting communication. And so I've been doing this the whole way through, both running everything parallel to each other. And now to be able to look at this training and developing all people in the Parole Board context, it is just fantastic. It's just like, it's a dream to bring everything together. And in the parole context, I always say we never take our eye off the ball with risk. I mean, risk is fundamental. That's what we're assessing all the time. We're looking at that, but it's ensuring that we do it as fair as possible, and adapting language and making communication effective, so that we hear everyone's voice.
And I saw you featured recently on the programme about the Parole Board and your decision making. And it's a sort of when I've watched that series, but it's a second or third series of it now, I've often thought, what decision would I make in that context? But it's a bit like when you read headlines in the newspaper about a court case, you're only getting half or maybe not even half the information.
You are.
You can't base it on that decision. And times I've thought, oh, well, I wouldn't have decided that. But then, of course, the person on the Parole Board is getting a huge dossier of hundreds of pages of information.
That's right. A Parole Board dossier can be, for those who aren't aware of it, there can be, because I work on the most complex cases, my dossiers are rarely under 400 pages, and can easily be 1,000 pages for a dossier of information that we have to read and undertake. And a hearing, many of the hearings that I actually attend as a Parole Board member they're the sole hearing on the day. And so they can last the whole day, and it's not unheard of for a hearing to go over one day and be scheduled for a couple of days in some cases. So it's lengthy evidence, both written and oral, in order to make the decision. And of course, the best will in the world, the people who produce those programs, they have to cut it down to 30 minutes. For the case that I was on, it's cut down to 30 minutes. So that's.
Is it nerve-wracking being on television, like promoting, or not promoting, that's not the right word, I suppose, but showcasing our work? Was there something nerve-wracking about that?
Is it nerve-wracking? I wouldn't say it was nerve-wracking. It's challenging for me, because I'll tell you why it's challenging. I'm now a trainer who's training people about effective questioning of people. And I'm the first person to say I do not always get it right by any stretch. It's one thing knowing how to do something theoretically, and to evaluate someone else's interviewing skills and to say, oh, you could have done this and that's a lengthy question, or that language is complex. When you're live doing it yourself, obviously it's difficult because you've got the cognitive challenges. I mean, in the world of interviewing, we talk a lot about the cognitive load, and you've got the where you're trying to get when if I'm doing a risk analysis in the parole context, I'm looking at risk of serious harm in the community and whether the public are protected. And I've got to have an idea of where I want to go with that and all the witnesses that are going to be questioned. And doing that is a cognitive demanding task to do it. When we've got IT now, a lot of hearings now, or 90% of hearings are done via video link now. And we know, I think a lot of people say working remotely via IT is tiring. So we've got all the cognitive demands of doing that, trying to see what's going on in the room. Formulating your questions on top of that is an additional cognitive load. And even though I know the theory, even as I say, I can evaluate anyone's interview, sometimes I can look at transcripts of my own and say, oh dear, Brendan, you made that laborious trying to get that point across. And I think we've got to all accept, and I'm the first to put my hands up, we can always improve. We don't always get it perfect. We've just got to try and get better and better and better with our skills of asking questions. So in answer to your question, Emily, to put yourself on television, it wasn't so much the cameras. The cameras were okay. The production company were fabulous. None of that was it was fine. I think, to be fair, I had an experience the previous year of being filmed for a public hearing that had been filmed live, gone from a prison to the Royal Courts of Justice, and so in that case there would have been academics present, there would have been the press present, all sorts of media present there. Probably some senior people from the Parole Board would have been present. So I didn't know who was in that room at the Royal Courts of Justice. I didn't want to know who was in that room. That was live. Everything I said was obviously going to come out in the Royal Courts of Justice. So if anything, there's more pressure on the live hearing going out than there was on the BBC production, because if I didn't get something quite right in that, in terms of my question or my words, the chances are I might have been cut.
I don't know about you, Jerry and Bryony, but suddenly I've become really aware that Brendan might be analysing our type of questions and the way that we're asking the questions. And so I use too many words. So I really just want to say that out loud. Maybe you could give us some feedback at the end.
I do too. I speak too quickly. Okay. Now, one of the things, and I know it, and I try and work on it. And one of the things interesting, I'll just speak about this a little bit. When I go in and assess a vulnerable victim or witness, or if I use the term complainants often for the same sort of thing, if I go into a police interview, I model the appropriate pace. So I would have I'd have the investigative interviewer with me, the police interviewer, and I'd have the vulnerable person who's going to be interviewed by the police. So the role of the intermediary is I go in there and I do a communication assessment. And most of the people that I actually assess would have a combination of mental health difficulties and intellectual disabilities, and those are the likely barriers to communication. So that's what I'm assessing when I go into that context. But what I try to do, and it really forces me to slow down, is I model the pace. I model the right pace for questioning someone who has impaired working memory, who can only listen to a short sentence, a short question, who needs time to process information, who needs time to think to get the answer, who needs time to find the words to give you the answer. So I model that pace. And I quite often say to the person, have I got this right? Am I doing this okay? Do I need to slow down? And I will model it. So I know how to do it, Emily. I do know how to slow down. And when I'm working in practice, I can slow down. But I do realise sometimes, as I do occasional lectures at university and occasional, training and stuff, and I think You're talking too quickly, Brendan. Slow down. So yes, I'm working on it. But that's what goes on in a communication assessment. So I want to sing the praises as well of speech and language therapists, who I did not really know anything about until about 20 years ago. And now they're a big part of my life, my professional life, working with speech and language therapists, and I learn from them, share information. So I just want to just say, as psychologists, let's not forget there is a wonderful profession out there called speech and language therapy who do a fantastic job. And also some of the other registered intermediaries who are occupational therapists and social workers and mental health workers and educational workers, and these types of people who are doing it. So I will be obviously looking at language when I assess someone who's vulnerable in terms of what's the barrier to communication. That's what it's all about. So I've talked about working memory, about question length, but I'll be remembering some of the forensic psychology principles that we think about acquiescence. And I'm looking for that. Are people just answering yes to me when I'm asking questions? At court, I would see compliance if some people, if the communication is not managed, they just want to go home. I mean, all the work that Gisley Johnson has published about acquiescence and compliance, it's really important. So that's always at the back of my mind. That people, they'll say, no, I don't want to break. I don't want to break. I want to carry on. I want to go home. So I'm aware of all these issues that are forensic psychology issues in the courtroom or in the police station. But the mental health side of things, some people, they don't really quite understand what is it about mental health that is a barrier to communication. So we often talk about anxiety, and we talk about anxiety in the parole board context, that prisoners coming for a parole hearing are anxious. Most of them are anxious. Probably all of them are anxious. But what does anxiety do to communication? And that's what we're getting at in the intermediary role is what does it actually do? And depression, how does that depression actually affect communication? If you're interviewing someone who has depression or psychosis, or someone who's hearing voices or has intrusive thoughts of whatever nature, how is that a barrier to communication? Pressure of speech, if they may have mania and really talking quickly. And I'm looking for triggers. So when I go into a police interview room, I try and identify as quick as possible what the potential triggers are. And so I will work with people who have autism as well, and there might be sensory triggers. There might, there's so much going on that would be very easy to miss if we don't actually think about it. And I was thinking of this in the police context, in police interview rooms. I think of it in the court context. But I also think of it in the parole context. And that's why this training is really, really important, because all of these issues can quite easily come into the parole hearing room. And we think, right, okay, are we managing these as effectively as we can in terms of the communication? And one other issue that my speech and language therapist colleagues would really want me to mention is something called developmental language disorder. So I'm going to mention it because they want me to mention it. And quite often you focus on a WACE and a WACE result and about working memory. The courts have this cut-off for intellectual disability. You have intellectual disabilities or you haven't. You're 70 on an IQ score, or you're above it or you're below it. But what about the borderline IQ scores? And the people that would be on adaptive programs in a prison context, and the speech and language and communication needs there. But even beyond that, the developmental language disorder, which is, can be quite prevalent in young people, and it can go into, adulthood with them. We're not trained in that. I certainly wasn't trained in that. Unless you've had some sort of additional training or postgraduate training, you're not going to be looking out for this. And we're doing, and forensic psychologists, we're doing risk assessments. And so my argument is going to be, in order to get the best information to complete your best risk assessment, surely we've got to be really on top of the communication issues when we're interviewing people who have been detained, wherever they've been detained, adapt our communication and make sure we're getting that bit right in order that we get the best information to inform our risk assessment. So that's I think is really, really important, and I think that's where both where my work aligns where it all sort of comes along the same path. Because I'm really, a big part of my life is risk assessments, forensic risk assessments. But I actually really want to keep working on the communication side and making sure that that's getting better and better.
As we're talking about intermediaries, I'm sort of thinking about appropriate person
Yeah.
role, and sort of curious about how that, where the crossover is. Would you have an intermediary and an appropriate person at the same time, or how would that work?
Will depend on your jurisdiction. And in Northern Ireland, you will have an appropriate adult and an intermediary potentially. You're talking about really about police suspect interviews, I think.
Yeah.
So you will have both of those. You can have both of those in a police interview, in a police suspect interview in Northern Ireland. It can happen in England and Wales. Scotland is a different jurisdiction again. In England and Wales, it can happen. You'd have the intermediary in with an appropriate adult. It would be rare. Intermediaries argue it should be used more often. And the difference being the appropriate adult role is it's actually broader. So one element of the appropriate adult role is communication. That's absolutely part of their role, but they're there in a much broader capacity, where the intermediary role is absolutely independent, it's impartial, and it's purely about communication. So although I'm talking about mental health, and all I'm talking about language and everything, it's all, the only reason I'm interested in mental health is how is it a barrier to communication and how can it be better managed? So when I come in with a psychologist hat, a psychologist background, obviously trained psychologist coming in, I'll be looking at things like grounding techniques. If someone is dissociated, so I'll be looking at dissociation, for instance, many of the cases that I'm invited to as an intermediary will be allegations of sexual offending. So a complainant is alleging sexual offending, and I will see dissociation quite a lot. So it's I'll be given advice: how do you manage dissociation? How do you manage if someone is? I'm looking at the safety aspect, getting people stabilised before that interview. Giving them escape routes out of the interview room, talking about all these issues before any police interview actually commences. That's the sort of areas that my expertise would obviously give me the confidence to talk about. So those are the areas, and I wouldn't necessarily expect someone who's in the appropriate adult role to be knowing the whole breadth of that. But they have other things to do. So they're involved in other issues in the custodial bit. They're there for the person having their rights read to them, and they'll be there for other things as well. But a parent can be an appropriate adult, and I think there's a statutory basis for young people to have qualified people being an appropriate adults, like youth offending teams or whatever. But for adults, I don't think that's quite in place yet. I think there's pockets of very good practice in England and Wales, but I don't think it's as it's set out as so much as it is for young people who are in trouble with the police.
Also, I've worked on the Isle of Man where they have an advocate, which is, I guess, a similar sort of role. It's somebody supporting to make sure that they understand what's going on, basically.
Yeah,
and that's.
but it is. So I have been in police interviews with a complainant, and I use that term neutral, the neutral term complainant, and I've been in there where I have been the intermediary. I've been the registered intermediary in that room, dealing with communication, and there's also been a mental health worker as well. And so part of that job then is to tease out the difference in our roles, and what are you going to do? What am I going to do? And what am I taking the lead on, and what are you taking the lead on? So I'm not a support worker. When I work as an intermediary, I'm not a support worker. I'm there for communication, enabling effective communication.
Can a forensic psychologist then train to be an intermediary? Is it additional training in some way?
Historically, intermediaries have only been around in England and Wales. They were piloted in 2004. They were rolled out in England and Wales in 2008. So they're relatively young profession in that respect. When I joined, you were expected to come into the role knowing how to assess communication, knowing how to adapt to communication. You were expected to know it coming in. And the only training that I got was in those days was to learn more about the court process, about what the legislation was, and what the rules were to get. You can make big mistakes very quickly if you go into a courtroom and don't know what you're doing and don't know what you're allowed to do. So it was about that. We had role players, we had a judge come to speak to us, and we had barristers speak to us, and we had that side of stuff. Now I get the impression now that there is more emphasis. There's still a desire that people come in, are able to assess communication, know what they're doing, but there's more of an understanding now that you can't just bring in a forensic psychologist or just bring in a speech and language therapist from a different context, place them in this role, and not give them some specific training about assessing communication for this particular role. If I just give you an example, so I would be when I'm looking at language that's needed to be used. As I say, a lot of the allegations that I'd be in the interview room would be sexual offences. So I would want to know about the language that people use for, anatomy, sexual, parts of the body. I'd want to know that. If it was a fraud case that's been investigated, I might need to do an assessment of the sort of language that's going to be used, whether they understand what a debit card is, a credit card, that's the sort of language that's involved in there. So it's specific to the task and the actual day, as opposed to, it's not a general assessment. It's actually what is required for this person to be effectively communicated with in the interview or at court, and things might change. So with mental health, it's very dynamic, obviously. So I might assess someone today, and next week I meet them and to do the interview, and it's totally different. In fact, that's happened. So I have been to an interview, to an assessment before. I've done a communication assessment. Someone's been verbal. They've spoken to me, answered all the questions. I've gone along 1 week later to the interview for the police to do the interview, and the person's been non-verbal. And a completely different presentation when it came to actually being interviewed. And so you've got to know how to deal with that, how to manage that. And the police will be expecting some advice from you on what to do in those circumstances. But yes, if someone is a forensic psychologist, if they have, they've got experience of adapting communication, I mean, it would seem to lend itself nicely to anyone who's worked with intellectual disabilities, or those that in that sort of environment, who's got experience of adapting communication, who can demonstrate how they've done it, how it's been effective. Those are the sorts of competencies you'd be wanting to demonstrate, and then you'd hone in, I guess, onto the interview room and what. But there's not many forensic psychologists doing this. I'm not really sure why. I'm not really sure why it's not. It might appeal more to those. Forensic psychology obviously has the forensic and legal side of it. It's got the investigative side of it. It might appeal more to people in that environment. But I think those who are working with forensic population outside of that have a lot of skills to bring from, facilitating groups, from adapting communication. I think there's a lot more could do it if they had the time and the space to do it.
And what sort of struck me, I've interviewed quite a few people who've already been convicted, and you're doing sort of mitigation. Is a reason this person might have done this offence, and several people I've interviewed in that context, some with a sort of identified learning disability and some not, have not understood the legal process at all, and done a fitness to plea interview, and they've got no idea, that they don't understand that they could, the role of their solicitor, for instance, that they have to instruct their solicitor, and they've already been convicted. They've often pleaded guilty because they think, well, they've got evidence, or I did do it. They don't know that they could not plead not guilty, and that it has to be proven. And I think it's almost too late by then for somebody, and that's not my role, obviously, in that position when I'm doing an assessment, but I'm struck by people not understanding the legal process. And I was recently, as I think you were, on a jury, and I was struck by the other jurors not understanding really what was not necessarily
Yeah,
what was going on,
yeah,
but the intricacies of there's just so not understanding why people might react that way in a witness in a witness position or giving their evidence, and why people might say the things they've said. And it was quite striking to me going in from a different position of being on a jury.
yeah. I mean, we've spoken before last year, but I have been an expert witness. So, I've done that, and I always just think back to one occasion when I was the expert witness. I know all this stuff. I know all the theory. I know how to stop how to say, look, give me time. I need some thinking time. Can you ask me just one question at a time? Can you take, stop the pressure? You're asking these questions too fast. Slow down a bit. I can do all of that. I have the skill set. I do it for other people. And when it was happening to me, I was employing those skills. And when you do expert witness training, they'll say to you, just take a sip of water. That's not what I was doing earlier, by the way. That was a genuine cough. But they will say, if you want thinking time, take a sip of water. It slows it down. And it's it's a tactic that they tell you on expert witness training. And I know all of that, and yet it was so tiring. It was so because getting the leading questions, I knew I was being taken. I was just aware all the time of where people were trying to take me. And I was like, no, that's and you've got to you've got to intervene, and you've got to be you've got to have the skill set and the wherewithal to be able to do that. And you've got to say if you don't understand a word, or you don't understand the way the sentence has been worded, or you've got to say, no, stop. Can you say that to me in easy language, please? I don't know what you're talking about. And it's hard for any of us, in that sort of environment. So I don't know what you're talking about. What are you saying? What in that context? What does that word mean? And that's what we're expecting of people to be able to do. And what happens if we don't know it? We take the gist of it, and we give the best answer we think, but that could come back and bite us if we are taking our chances on it, don't want to show our cards, don't want to say we don't know something, and we give the best answer we can with the interpretation we've got of it. I think if we're like that ever, and what's it like to be vulnerable in a court, be asked questions, to not have someone there who's going to intervene and say, no, that's complex. That's two questions. And I write these reports, for the courts quite a lot, for the lawyers. And one thing that always baffles me, as I say, always one question at a time, not two. And the first thing that's said, and people say, yeah, I understand, this is all straightforward stuff. I understand it all. And the first question that's asked is, can you hear me and see me okay? And I was like, we've just had this chat where you say you'll never ask, you know all this, and I've had to intervene before, and the vulnerable person next to me on one occasion has said, yes, I can, yeah. And I was thinking, well, I can't see you, I can hear you, I can't see you, so I've had to intervene. And I'd say, well, I'd say that's, for the first question there, yes, I can hear you in this, in the room. For the second question that you've asked in, the second part of that question, no, I can't see you, and I have to come in and make the point. That is two questions, and that's how easy it is to slip up. And I think we just need to be trying and be aware of these issues. We think we may. I mean, it sounds simple. Can you hear me and see me okay? What about the answer to one of it's yes, and the answer to the other bit's no?
Yeah, so true.
And unless you've got the ability to say, oh yes, well, actually, is that a trick question? Because I can do one bit and I can't do the other.
Yeah. And that's the additional cognitive load. And yes, particularly with somebody who might have a learning disability, they're still thinking about that when you ask the next question a second later.
Absolutely. and that's the problem. They're still thinking about that dilemma. They're not listening to the next question effectively. And then you've lost it. And so that's exactly where the intermediary would come in to try and iron out these difficulties, to try and see these miscommunications or potential miscommunications and deal with them. So it's fabulous. It's a fabulous role, and it allows me to bring all my psychological knowledge into that environment. So it's really good. And I think, the courts, they see forensic psychologists on my CV goes in. I'm an intermediary, but I'm a forensic psychologist, and there's respect for that. And particularly there's mental health cases, and they think, okay, and it's really good. And I think it's really good to promote our role as forensic psychologists in that context.
One of the things you were talking about the parole board is the difference between a parole board and a sort of a court of law in another way, where one being inquisitorial and one being adversarial. Could you say a bit more about that? You were talking about that previously.
Parole board should be inquisitorial, so there should be. We're not trying to lead people. There's no one in there who's trying to lead people to give an answer that they want to hear. As might happen in the adversarial system. So in the adversarial system, if I was giving evidence and I was a complainant, if I was a victim, the defence lawyer would be putting another case to me. They'd be putting the defendant's case to me, and trying to get me to agree with that case, and using language to try and get me to agree with it. That doesn't happen in the parole context. It should be open. Let's be careful with the word of questions. The question format is not leading. It shouldn't be leading. It should be trying to get the evidence. But we're trying to, in the parole context as well, and then I'll just say about the questioning again on that. Part of the training that we're doing at the moment is, we want to cut out the extraneous questions, the ones that don't need to be asked. So there's a lot of information in a dossier. You don't need to ask a question when you've got the information. I mean, if there's contradictory information, then obviously you've got to probe it and look at it. But if it's there and it's in the dossier, and the thing is that we all need to be aware of all the time is every question we ask for someone who's got a communication difficulty, it's another little notch on fatiguing them. So if we can avoid asking the question, they're going to remain more alert. So when we actually ask the questions that we actually do need the answers for, and we actually need them to think carefully about to give us that information, their cognitive processing is going to be fresher. It's not going to be fatigued. So we don't want to tire them out. So we only want to ask the questions that we need to know the answers to. And that's really important. I think it's important for everyone. And I think that's the byproduct that everyone in the parole board acknowledges. If we get better and better and better at this, then everyone benefits. Every witness benefits. So, psychologists being questioned benefit. Everyone, offender managers, community offender managers, everyone's going to benefit. So there we are. I'm passionate about this, you might have noticed.
Yeah, that it shows, and it's really important. I mean, it should be. This is people's lives talking about. It should be people in there, advocating for people to know.
I'll just mention a little bit about nuance, and I think it's important to mention nuance, particularly with Bryony's stuff about the appropriate adult. One interesting area about the intermediary role is, and in the legal context, in the court context, in police suspect context, obviously people have a right to remain silent. They don't have to incriminate themselves. So this is a little bit nuanced here. What is the intermediary role in that area? So you're not there to, if someone's taken legal advice and the legal advice is you're not going to incriminate yourself, you don't talk. It's not my job as an intermediary to make them talk. As that's absolutely not my job. My job in that would be if the lawyer allowed me in, and there's legal privilege that's going on here as well, so that's a term. But if the lawyer allows me to be in that room with them when they're giving their legally privileged advice, which some do, my job would be to facilitate that conversation between the lawyer and the police suspect, so that they understand what inferences from silence are. If they give a no comment interview and then it goes to court. And then the court can draw an inference. So the lawyer's got to explain all of that to someone who might have a communication difficulty, and my job would be to help the lawyer explain adverse inferences to someone who struggles with language. And it's a very difficult concept to try and break down and explain. But my job is certainly not to make someone answer. because they've got legal advice. So we've got to think about the nuances in all these environments of where you are and what's going on. So,
And you mentioned about being a pracademic as well. Could you say a bit more about that?
yes, so I did a practitioner doctorate in criminal justice, and it was before, I think at that time there was probably only one forensic psychology practitioner doctorate. I think there was one at that time, or it might have come in just after I'd applied for my place and got it on criminal justice. But I was supervised, my thesis was supervised by Professor Becky Milne at Portsmouth, and I was looking at intermediaries and defendants and that side of stuff. And I've been working with her and Dr. Kevin Smith, who's at Sunderland University now. He was the National Vulnerable Witness Advisor for the National Crime Agency. He's now at University of Sunderland as a lecturer. And we've published a number of papers together. And again, it's where I've been very fortunate, or I've guided my life, whichever way you want to take it. And I've explored, and I just talked very briefly about two topics that I've honed in on and explored because I was really interested. One of them is parole. So I did a bit of piece of research with Becky and with Kevin about the Parole Board and the context of intermediaries. So just to see, have they been used? Is there a role for them? What do members think? So we developed a questionnaire, and that paper was published last year. So we're really pleased with that. And on the back of that, the Parole Board, the Parole Board supported the research, and on the back of that, we now got guidance for members about the use of intermediaries. So it's what's really good. It's impact. This research is actually having impact, and that's what I want. It's not theoretical. It's practical and it's having impact. And the other one I'm particularly proud of is the one on dissociative disorder, dissociative identity disorder, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder. And I got into that because the referrals from the police were coming through, and DID, dissociative identity disorder, was being categorized as a personality disorder, and it was being referred to me that way. And I was declining the referrals. And I was saying, no, that's not in the the personality disorders that I know. This is something else. This is about dissociation, dissociative disorders, and no. And then I had a police officer contacted me directly at one point, and he said, Brendan, I know about your work. I know who you are. I know you're a forensic psychologist. I know you work with mental health. I know you work with all these sorts of things. Can you help me with one of these cases? And I said, I'm sorry, I can't. It's I've got boundaries as a forensic psychologist. I work within my expertise and whatever. And his question to me really made me think. And he said, Brendan, if you can't do it as an intermediary, as a forensic psychologist with the experience you've got, who can I go to? Who can I go to actually help me? And I was like, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to have to go away and think about it. So I went away and I started speaking to experts in DID, clinical psychologists. I went on training courses. I did some research with Becky and Kevin. I contacted the National Crime Agency. I got the data on how big is this problem of trying to find intermediaries for these cases. So I did all of that with Becky and Kevin. We got the data. Then we did some questionnaires, find out what advice police have been given. And on the back of all of this, of the research, getting it published, of speaking to clinical psychologists, of going to conferences and all sorts of stuff, I said, okay, I can do this. I will, as long as I'm speaking to the right people. I'm not doing this as an expert witness. I'm not doing it, just be very clear what I'm doing here. And I can, start getting into this role. And it's been really interesting. And really, really interesting. And what was really nice is, someone has read my article before, of this paper that we published. They've read it and they've actually said, we think we can actually come to the police now because we've read your paper and we know that you've got insight into this and no one else has shown any insight before. And so it's having impact. The paper is, to actually get research out there, which is having an impact. It's fabulous. It really is fantastic. So sometimes you've got to stretch your comfort, go outside a little bit, stay within your boundaries. That's obviously really important. Have the right supervision. and just know where your boundaries are and where your limitations are and what you can and can't do. That's obviously always important in what we do.
What about then thinking about, so as we draw the episode to a close, what's on the horizon?
I'm hoping that I can continue working with the Norwegian Centre for Human Rights and do some more work in Europe. It has been suggested that might happen, so I'm hoping to do some more of that, which would be really interesting. I've been invited to speak at a conference, the Vulnerable Accused Conference in Cardiff. I was going to say next year, but it's now this September 2025, about vulnerability and about interviewing. So I'm going to do that. I'm collaborating with researchers at the University of Limerick and Queen's University in Belfast, who are looking at the intermediary scheme development in Ireland. So I'm working on that. I'm a member of the EU Cost Implemented program. Professor Dave Walsh at De Montfort University leads that, and it's about investigative interviewing and spreading good practice in Europe about that. So I'm involved in that. And I have 8 years service now with the Parole Board as a Parole Board member. If I go beyond 10 years, then it's mandatory that I chair hearings as opposed to being a psychologist co-panelist. So that is on the horizon as well, is to move into chairing oral hearing panels. That's a training for that, and taking on that challenge as well is on the horizon. So lots of different things are on the horizon, lots of things, and I am lucky I can direct my attention in areas I want to go in.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Brenda. It's been really interesting, and I think each of our episodes shows the variety of jobs that people can be in with forensic psychology, but you do most of them all on your own. So well done for that. It's really nice, really interesting to hear your sort of views of different things, and it just leaves me to say, let's talk forensic psychology.